So it's my great pleasure to introduce Alex Huezo. And he did his MA in Latin American Studies at UCLA. Yes. And then went on to do his PhD in Global and Socio-Cultural Studies at Florida International. And let me give you a taste of some of his publications that predate this wonderful book, which is called Visions of Global Environmental Justice, Comunidades Negras and the War on Drugs in Colombia, which he'll be talking about today. So he has a book manuscript not yet under contract called Justicia Ambiental, Resistencia Afro-Pacífica contra la Fumiga. And he's got, just to give you a taste of some of his other articles, he's got an article with co-authored article, Corrective Lenses for a Myopic State, Unseeing Coca or Not Seeing Comunidades Negras in Colombia, in World Development. And he has another piece called Contested Natures, Coca, the War on Drugs and Ecologies of Difference in Colombia's Afro-Pacific Communities. He is currently, he was a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the School of Environmental Science at Berkeley, and he's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. So let's give Alex a warm welcome back.
And I take that one. It is up there.
Here's the flicker.
This is my camera controller. You said I can go without the mic, right? Yes. Okay. All right. So hi everyone. Very excited to be here. And I will share green now. Okay. So yeah, as stated before, I was a student here, an MA student in the Latin American Studies program, and that is in large part of the inspiration for this book that I'm going to present to you today. I'll talk about the artwork, I guess, a little bit later on. Doesn't seem to be. Oh, try again. Okay, sorry. So, in the title of the book are the words visions and global environmental justice, and then of course Comunidades Negras and the war on drugs in Colombia. So I'm going to actually just take a second to talk about the word visions. Oops. Okay. So as an MA student here, I was doing research. My MA research was centered in the city of Cali, Santiago de Cali, which is in the southwestern corner of Colombia. I circled in pink on this map here of Colombia. And by the way, this whole presentation is going to be very, there's going to be a lot of images. So it's going to be image centric. And so I hope you can see. So Cali drew my interest because I had heard that, after decades of people being displaced from the countryside to major urban cities in Colombia, that I heard that there was potentially a rise in the number of supernatural entities being talked about in the city. And so my MA, research was about, that thesis was about finding out if that was true, right? And I specifically refer to these supernatural entities as visions for a bunch of different reasons. They're typically in Colombia be referred to as myths or as legends, all kinds of other words, ghosts, right? And I specifically like the term visions because they don't carry the same stigma as a term like myths, where when you hear the word myth, oftentimes you think, do I really believe this, right? There's a kind of uncertainty about it, right? If it's more than anything, it's kind of a doubt whether it really exists, right? Or there's just kind of foolish people telling these tales, right? And so the term vision kind of removes that stigma, and it's also a term that I encountered when reading anthropological studies of these kind of entities and other phenomena in Colombia. And as I was doing that research, I came across books like these, right, it's a mix of children's book and then an adult book about myths and legends in Colombia, right? In terms of visions, I think the most popular one that people are familiar with in the Americas is probably La Llorona, right? So these are the kinds of entities I'm talking about. They're the kinds of entities that people have heard about, continue to tell stories about, right? And in the process, I also learned things happening. For instance, this widespread use of Ouija boards in Colombia, where junior high students were communicating with sicarios and assassins that had been killed, their classmates, right? And were being possessed, dozens at a time, because the explanation that I was given was that they weren't closing the portal to the other side. And that's why, and there's lots of news clips that you could find on YouTube about this kind of thing, right? These are the kind of stories I was encountering, basically speaking to the fact that I indeed found some evidence that there was a lot of, tales and other forms of the supernatural appearing in the city, right? And as I was writing my MA thesis, one of the people I invited to be part of my committee was an outside member, a Colombian anthropologist, had no connection to UCLA whatsoever. And they were skeptical of what I was writing and felt that, and the comment was that, you're kind of seems like you're exoticizing my culture, right? Which is a critique I took very seriously. And so after revising the thesis to kind of address those comments, but also thinking that I was going to continue to do this for doctoral research, I never published anything about this, right? And yeah, after being in communication with my family, who also kind of tells similar kind of stories, because they're family from El Salvador, they actually sent me similar kind of books from El Salvador, telling about the same kinds of tales in Colombia. And so I didn't, whereas I was still kind of having kind of mixed feelings about whether I was exoticizing the supernatural in Colombia and these tales, I just kind of held on to it and said, I'm going to do something with this eventually, right? I'm going to continue this research. I didn't end up continuing that research, but it does make its way into the table of contents for this book, right? So you see after the introduction, there's a chapter called Tricksters, Seductresses, and Eco-Monsters. And then there's a chapter called Devils, Witches, and Narco-Monsters. And then there's a chapter called Killer Plants and the Two-Headed Monster. And then it goes into more kind of mundane, not as exciting titles, right? And so this is also the, what I'm going to present to you today. I'm going to go through, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, and then I'm going to take little vignettes from these different chapters to talk about and explain the connection, right? Primarily the connection between these two things, visions and global environmental justice, right? And I should state throughout that I hired an illustrator for this work for a bunch of different reasons. And one reason is that it's kind of difficult to talk about violence and things kind of happening. Another reason was that I wanted to literally illustrate what some of these supernatural entities look like. And the images, I always have one image at the beginning of every chapter that takes up a full page. And the idea being for you, I was inspired by the TV show Ozark, if anybody's seen it, where they give you some symbols at the beginning of every episode. And then I would usually pause the frame and think about what's going on in those symbols and what's going to happen in the chapter, right? And so that's the intent of these images, to kind of get you started thinking about what's happening here and what does it have to do with the content of the book. And I'm going to actually ask you about this shortly, right? So I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to mix with explanation with reading. This is the first lines of the book. Mosquitoes and other insects buzzed around me while I tried to pretend it was not affecting me. I swatted them away haphazardly while taking pictures and recording video with my iPhone. I'm pretty sure that my eyeballs were sweating from the humidity. Moments earlier, I had sunk thigh deep into soft ground, even though I had been warned to only step on roots to avoid that predicament. It happened so fast that I felt like I was being swallowed whole by planet Earth. Thankfully, the guys pulled me out of the mud and then made fun of me. They do this on a regular basis just to get to their farm plot? I could not even imagine how much time and effort, how much sweat, how much money to lose it suddenly. My misstep provided some comic relief in an otherwise somber occasion. I was visiting a farm plot fumigated with the chemical glyphosate. This herbicide, the key component of Monsanto's Roundup, is commonly used to eliminate weeds in everything from personal gardens to large agro-industrial farm plots. It is a chemical that is gradually being banned throughout the world because it is linked to cancer in human beings, as well as the loss of flora and fauna, insects such as bees. However, intentionally spraying one's garden or crop dusting an agro-industrial farm plot to eliminate weeds is quite different from having your food crop sprayed without your permission, under the premise that you were harvesting coca leaves to be processed into cocaine. And so what you see on the left is me trailing this group of farmers through vegetation on the way to their farm plot. And this is when I fell into the mud and had to be pulled out. And then what you see on the right is an image of their farm plot a week after it had been sprayed with the chemical glyphosate with the intention of eradicating coca plants, right? So you can see that the vegetation is dry, right? And they've lost a lot of their crops. Both the market for cocaine and the pressure to limit the supply of the drugs are driven by U.S. demands, or excuse me, skipped ahead. Aerial eradication of the spraying of illicit crops with aircraft has been a U.S. war on drugs strategy in Latin America since the marijuana boom of the 1970s. It is a controversial practice because of the harmful chemicals that have been used in the past, as well as the fact that the spray can drift with the wind and affect much more than was initially targeted. Colombia is the only country where it has been conducted recently. So these are the years in which aerial eradication has been conducted recently. It was, when I was doing this research in 2015, it was full steam ahead because the thought was it was going to be suspended eventually. It was suspended that year. They exhausted the glyphosate that they had in order to eradicate as much coca as possible. Then the program restarted in 2020 until 2022, and there are concerns that it's going to start again, right? And I don't go in the book. I don't go too much into the science of all the effects of glyphosate in the spraying. But in the course of conducting this research, I did have people send me images like this of a child's hands and feet and blaming those effects on the spray, right? So for a bit more context, it was conducted in Colombia in these years, and now there's fears with the current presidential administration that the U.S. is going to again kind of force Colombia into the situation of resuming the spraying. Both the market for cocaine and the pressure to limit the supply of the drug are driven by U.S. demands that imperil socio-ecological communities south of its border. The vast majority of the cocaine seized in the United States and the world in general is processed in Colombia. Colombia is also a major supplier of the coca leaves processed into cocaine. This was not always the case. The cultivation of coca plants, the processing of coca leaves, and the trafficking of cocaine gravitate towards spaces out of reach of drug eradication authorities. However, counter-narcotic measures enforced in one part of the world will likely shift those activities to another part of the world because those measures did not impact the demand. U.S. efforts to limit coca leaf cultivation in Bolivia and Peru in the 1980s and 90s shifted coca leaf cultivation into southern central Colombia and then into the Colombian Amazon. In the 2000s, aerial eradication campaigns intensified in those areas as part of the Plan Colombia Agreement that Colombia signed with the United States. In response, coca cultivation has shifted more towards more remote locations, not connected to roads, not easily accessible to manual eradication crews who can pull the plants out of the ground, and not easily detectable via satellite imaging. So I've circled the southwestern corner of Colombia because that's where I did the majority of this research. And as mentioned, this war on drugs strategy was carried out in Bolivia and Peru, which eventually shifted coca cultivation into southern Colombia and the plains between Colombia and Venezuela. And aerial eradication efforts there eventually shifted to this southwest corner, which now has easy access to Central America and Mexico, which is now this is where the current coca boom is happening, and this is also the current route to the United States. It's important to point out that this is an area very disconnected in a lot of different sentiments. It's physically disconnected because you can see here there are roads in red, major highways in red, and then the other smaller roads in black. There's literally only two roads that connect the entire Pacific coast of Colombia to the Andean highlands, right? So the main source of transportation throughout this area are these riverine networks that are highlighted here in blue, right? And so it's physically disconnected, it's culturally disconnected because most of the folks in the highlands are mestizo and descendants of Spaniards, whereas this is mostly Afro-descendant and indigenous. What I've highlighted here in this beige color is Afro-descendant territories, also known as Comunidades Negras, which are, basically run from the border of Ecuador all the way up to Panama. And here's a banner in the office of the Process of Black Communities in Buenaventura. And you can see that the iconography of this institution, which is fundamental to the creation of these territories, is very connected to Africa. It's very connected to legacies of resistance against slavery, right? And making an ancestral connection to these lands and to these communities in the Americas. And then here's just an image of kids playing along one of these rivers, which are vital to the life of the region. The guys that pulled me out of the mud that day were farmers in the Comunidad Negra of Temue on the Guapi River in southwestern Colombia. They worked a farm plot together, and I was there to interview them and document what their plot looked like a week after an aerial eradication plane had sprayed their licit crops, yucca, white taro root, peach palm, mango, plantains, guava, etc., with glyphosate. They did not grow coca and had no idea why their plot had been sprayed. I asked them if there were farm plots nearby that did grow coca, and then later on the way back from their farm, I asked how coca arrived to the region. So this is that conversation. It arrived from Cali, from Nariño, Antioquia, with people from Medellin, all of them paisas. Paisas is the term from people from the department or the state of Antioquia, which is where Medellin is located. But in the Pacific region, it just kind of means outsiders, usually means white people that are Colombian. All of them paisas who come to our region. Imagine this: you have your plot of crops and they begin to harvest coca, and you cannot say anything because they threaten you. They took your land and you just have to shut up. They look for the weakest, least wise person in the community. They offer them money to rent the land, and they start taking our land. One does not want to create problems by speaking out. Something could happen to you. We cannot say anything. 4 years later, I visited the exact same farm plot to see how they were doing with the same group of guys. And on the way back from visiting the farm plot, this is what I wrote about this occasion. On the return from visiting the farm lot, I asked questions while recording on my iPhone as Teodoro, the same boat captain as my first trip, maneuvered the boat out of the shallow waters of the mangroves. Since aerial eradication had been suspended shortly after my original visit in 2015, this visit was largely about understanding the residual impacts of the spraying. We then discussed the potential for the aerial eradication suspension to be lifted, which seemed imminent as Colombia experienced a coca boom, and it wasn't indeed lifted. The conversation tailed off into silence. Maybe the thought of being sprayed again became too depressing to talk about anymore. The conversation shifted to the supernatural, without me asking about it. El Duende, he's the guy the one that knows how to play the guitar. And guitar music is what he uses to get the girls that had not been deflowered yet. And he is the one who's going to deflower them. A real scoundrel. That guy's a real scoundrel. Nowadays, approaching minors like that would land you in jail. Guys start laughing. Pretentious type, this guy, very pretentious. And this guy who was fond of music would come, he would listen to him play. The Duende said that he was going to lend the guitar to him when he finished. But he had another tune he wanted to play. He never finished that song. You don't hear about El Duende anymore. Has anyone heard about El Duende lately? And so this is a question I'll actually like to pose to the room. What does the appearance of coca in the region have to do with the disappearance or with the disappearance of these supernatural entities? So the appearance of coca and the disappearance of these supernatural entities. This is a question I posed at the beginning of the book, and I'm wondering if you all in this room have any thoughts on it. Yeah.
Coca is very exportable, at least located, and then it kind of makes the region a little less isolated because those trade routes, things are being exported, so it's a little more connected to the rest of Colombia, and that makes that kind of makes regional myths and regional culture a little makes it disappear a little bit.
Okay, so this connectedness to maybe other cultures, maybe, or just maybe a little more populated, so the lack of isolation means that people are not going to talk about these things as much. Okay.
It's the presence of outsiders.
Presence of outsiders. And can you expand on?
Well, in my experience, people only talk about supernatural things with close insiders. So if there's outsiders, Pisces coming in, there might be like a shutdown that you don't want to talk about these things with outsiders.
You don't want to talk about these things because you might look ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I've heard interpretations as well that as more people arrive from outside of a region, often leading to changes in land use in the region, like the traditional entities start to leave.
Okay.
Disappear, they start to wander elsewhere.
So that you linked it to a transformation of land.
Yeah.
And
that's what I've heard as this link.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Ben just brought up the word tradition, which is a complicated word for me, but I don't know what's going on here. But the whole kind of field or theme of the reinvention of tradition, I wonder where, if at all, any of this connects with broader cross-cultural thinking about what tradition is and how it's reinvented.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Think about the term that keeps coming to mind for me is enchantment, right? And it seems like perhaps when you have an actual threat, i.e., cartels moving in to it's produced their product, that sort of overshadows these more like supernatural enchanted sorts of threats, right? It's like, as opposed to like the duende right here, is that what he's called?
Yeah.
Now you actually have like the guy with the cartel with a gun behind your head,
Right.
And so maybe that's what you start paying attention to in
Right.
the world of like threats in the landscape.
So it was actually when I was doing those interviews in Cali, it's like, no, I'm not worried about those kind of entities. It's the live ones that I'm worried about. It's exactly kind of speaking to that point, right? Those are the actual threats. Hey, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add on, if there's like herbicides that are like destroying the forest and this entity has a connection directly to the forest, then how will he continue?
Well, how it will continue to survive,
Yeah.
right? So taking into account all these different kind of opinions, but also, I offer a lot of different possibilities for why this might be happening, right? In the first point, it is a community building tradition that communicates sociological values, right? So, if the physical landscape is changing, then those values are going to change along with it, right? The appearance of coca is accompanied by the war on drugs, both of which contribute to the displacement of humans and non-humans and ecological relations, right? And then in the third place, many people from the countryside are displaced to violent urban areas where the stories about visions are reimagined and reinterpreted, right? So there's a secondary question, more of a rhetorical question, which is, why did I connect these two stories, right? Well, in the first place, it was an opportunity. Well, in the first place, it was kind of a suggestion from the publisher, UC Press, like you should have some kind of hook that people can wrap their minds around and that will make sense for the rest of the book, right? And so the visions literally create a creative narrative framework for the book, right? One that it also lends itself to a lot of imagery. It allows me an avenue to talk about the biopolitics and the necropolitics of the war on drugs. And it also allows a space to address the global and more than human dimensions of environmental racism and justice. So this image that I showed you a few slides before is literally the amalgamation of these two stories connecting, right? Because on the left side, we see a community along the river, and we see an aerial eradication plane spraying glyphosate to get rid of coca, to eradicate coca on the horizon. And on the right side, we see El Duende and then another entity, La Tunda, who are both very much associated with the region. And the question I pose is, what's this look on her face about, right? Is she trying to scare you, or is she scared about the possibility of her own erasure, her own disappearance, right? So I have a two-part argument for this that flows throughout this book. Visions of Global Environmental Justice deconstructs the transnational myths that perpetuate the violence and environmental racism of the war on drugs. And conversely, it argues that the humans and non-humans rendered expendable by violence and pollution are indispensable to both the conceptualization and the realization of environmental justice globally. So let's talk about this term environmental justice for a minute. This is another graphic that's featured in the book in the last chapter that specifically talks about what contributions I've made to global environmental justice, right? The people in the globe are meant to look like continents, right? And the people on the top are, this one sign says stop the violence, and the other side sign says no more pollution, no más contaminación, right? And they're standing on the shoulders of the civil rights movement, right? Environmental justice struggles argue against the equitable distribution of environmental harms, with the idea being that no one should have to do with pollution, period, right? And lastly, environmental justice struggles reject the nature-culture divide that's so prevalent in Western society. And it also rejects the framing of the nature culture divide in popular environmentalism or mainstream environmentalism, where it's always about save this species, save the otters, save the bees, save this plant, save the world, save this, right? And the framing of environmental issues in that kind of vacuum, right? Environmental justice struggles, on the other hand, look at a lot of issues as an event. And they also challenge the nature culture divide by stating where we live is environment too, where the polluted city that we live in is environment as well, right? The problem with framing a lot of these as an event, though, if I give the example of the Exide recycling, it's a battery recycling plant that closed in Vernon, California, right? So there was all kinds of protests. There was, studies done on the soil of the people that lived around the recycling plant, and people found that there was lead in their soils. They had to replace the soil. They closed down the plant. The company declared bankruptcy in the United States and merely shifted its operations to Southeast Asia, where it opened up other recycling plants. So if we're looking at environmental justice issues as an event, we're missing the point that oftentimes an environmental justice in one part of the world results in an environmental injustice in another part of the world, right? That is certainly the case also with, stamping out with the Cocalero protests that happened in Southern Colombia, resulted in them stopping that aerial eradication in that part of Colombia, and then coca plants appearing in another part of Colombia, and the war on drug strategy being carried out in that other part of Colombia, right? So critical environmental justice studies looks at these issues as a structure, right? And in his book about critical environmental justice, David Pello argues that critical environmental justice should pay attention to intersectionality, to the multi-scalar dimensions of environmental justice, as alternatives to state-based solutions, because oftentimes the state itself is part of the reason why an environmental justice is happening, whether because of segregation or for many a host of other reasons, right? And finally, there's a call to analyze the more than human dimensions of environmental justice. And I argue that this book really speaks to what is shown here in yellow, right? The multi-scalar dimensions of environmental justice, because I'm thinking about it globally, environmental racism and justice globally, and also the more than human dimensions, which is why supernatural entities are part of this narrative. So I'm going to talk about chapter 1. I'm going to talk about this image for a second. And speaking of the word visions, this is a explanation of the cosmovision of the Afro-Pacific from Afro-Colombian scholar Alfredo Banin. Two spaces compete for and complement the life of the Pacific: the shamanic non-cultured space, the jungle, the depths of the water, enabler of creatures of the underworld, of the visions of souls, monstrosities, shadows, and powers of witchcraft, and the cultured space, where man's chores, fishing, agriculture take place, and where man recognizes himself with his fellow beings. It is the underworld where terrible beings spring from, but at the same time creates limits so that man does not transgress the laws of nature and be destroyed. Myths and legends carry these prohibitions, and at the same time prolong the spirituality of shamanism. Later in the chapter, I state, chapter 1 makes 3 interrelated arguments about supernatural visions and violence. As supernatural tales, visions discipline people to ensure the survival of their sociological communities, operating as a kind of biopower. As supernatural entities, visions and ghosts remind peasants of their expendability, which is a necropolitical continuity that began with the colonization of Latin America. As subjects of environmental justice studies, visions and ghosts remind scholars that violence against communities of color is inextricable from environmental racism, affecting all beings within sociological communities. And I'm going to read a quick vignette from this chapter. Angelica, a 28-year-old woman originally from Puerto Jara, Cauca, did not know much about visions until she moved to Sidon Nariño, which she described as a little town of ghosts. That's an image of Sidon Nariño. She encountered La Bruja, El Duende, and La Madre Monte in Sidon and stated, "Those things I believe in because I live them. I'm not going to tell my children about those things because for me it was very traumatic. And I'm someone who gets scared easily. It would be traumatic for them." I asked Angelica why there were more visions in Sidon than in Puerto de Jara, and she replied, "It is the evil of the past." In the most general terms, the evil of the past refers to a problem endemic to much of Latin America and the Caribbean, the precarity of rural peasants who do not possess the title of the land they occupy, or the means to defend themselves from armed groups. The monopolization of land and resources by Latin American elites and foreign capitalists has been the root cause of devastating conflicts such as the Mexican Revolution, the Guatemalan Civil War, the Cuban Revolution, the Salvadorian Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has interfered in these and many of these conflicts throughout the region because the redistribution of land and resources sought through these popular uprisings has been perceived as a threat to private business interests and democratic ideals, in quotes, fears of socialism and communism. The necropolitical history of the Pacific region is fundamental to understanding why Angelica stated that Sidon and Nariño was haunted by the evil of the past. While she was not exactly certain when this evil transpired, Angelica did believe that the town was haunted because it was in a zona coquero, an area where coca is cultivated. The images depict how her father-in-law, who was a city government official in the town, and others were murdered. The FARC had been present in the area for a long time when the Colombian military arrived to drive them out. That is the image you see on the top right. Military officers asked for help from city officials to find accommodations and other necessities in town. Once the military left town, the FARC murdered Angelica's father-in-law for his role in assisting their enemy. She explained, "People from here told me that they were chopping down people with machetes. Heads were rolling because of machetes. In other words, blood was flowing from the hills. You understand what I'm saying? Massacres. The guerrilla would toss their bodies into the river." And this is the image on the bottom right. For Mbembe, the massacre represents an instrument of modern-day warfare in the era of globalization and the ultimate expression of necropower. If power still depends on tight control over tight bodies or concentrating them in camps, the new technologies of destruction are less concerned with inscribing bodies within disciplinary apparatuses as inscribing them when the time comes, within the order of the maximal economy now represented by the massacre. Extending this analysis to Angelica's description of Sidon, the ghosts that haunt the town are the inscription of this ultimate expression of necropower on the collective psyche of those left behind. In other words, the ghosts remind the living that the peasants are expendable and the necropolitical order of the Colombian conflict. So the next chapter has an interesting title as well, Devils, Witches, and Narco Monsters. And I asked, what does the title of this chapter have to do with environmental justice? Devils, witches, and monsters are generally regarded as entities of supernatural origins that have acquired supernatural powers. Their presence and capabilities incite fear among the masses, which is why the stories of many visions are interpreted as metaphors for different kinds of people that have been othered. This chapter deconstructs accounts of these visions within the historical context of Colombia's third largest metropolis, Santiago de Cali. It draws from hundreds of years of stories about devils, witches, and monsters to highlight how the continual displacement of rural peoples, particularly Afro-descendant indigenous, has factored into the racial geography of this metropolis. In doing so, this chapter continues an argument from the previous chapter, which is that the silent violence of environmental racism is inextricable from the overt violence related to the struggles for the control of Colombian territory, i.e. the armed conflict and illicit activities such as drug trafficking. This chapter also presents this history as a means of relating Cali's settler colonial history to an entirely different form of environmental racism, which is the myth of overpopulation. And so I talk about the city Cali as an necropolis, particularly one part of the city as a necropolis, where a lot of that violence and pollution is concentrated. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip ahead here down to the third chapter. And whereas in the first two chapters, I talked about, accounts of visions that people had told me, in this chapter, I am inventing a vision, a supernatural vision, to describe the impacts of both the prohibition and the demand for drugs coming from the global north and being inflicted on the global south, right? So that's what this chapter, Killer Plants and the Two-Headed Monster, is about. And I very specifically and very intentionally use the word myth in a geopolitical context to describe the justifications for the war on drugs, whereas I'm using the word vision to describe these supernatural entities. The title of this chapter refers to creatures whose origins are distinctly different from those of the supernatural visions discussed up to this point in the book. Respectively, Killer Plants and the Two-Headed Monster are creatures born of geopolitical and critical social science imaginations of the war on drugs. The intent of this chapter is to explain the following: why U.S. imperialism in Latin America is fundamental to the genesis of these creatures, how these creatures are implicated in the environmental racism of the war on drugs, how these creatures thwart efforts of environmental justice communities resisting the war on drugs, why these creatures are emblematic of the necropolitical ecologies that displace, dispossess, and erase peasant communities, such as Comunidades Negras. So I'm going to zoom in on the two-headed monster. It's a metaphor that I've invented to explain how both the demand for illegal drugs and the war on drugs wreak havoc across species, ecosystems, and ways of being. The head on the left side of the image is drug production and trafficking, largely mobilized to satisfy the demands of US and Western European consumers. This head is composed of non-state armed actors, corrupted state actors, cultivators, violence, chemicals, and many other components that factor into the drastic transformation of the biophysical and cultural landscapes of drug-producing regions. This head is literally inhaling elements of the landscape, people, and trees through a nostril. The head on the right side of the image is the war on drugs, the Euro-Americanist framing of narcotics as an external threat emanating from the third world, in quotes, and therefore a mandate for US intervention in Latin America. Out of its mouth spew elements of violence, tanks, soldiers, guns, and criminalization, planes and handcuffs that are scorching a populated landscape. Though this monster predates Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs in the 1970s, it did not become a global menace until this war was militarized by Ronald Reagan in the 80s and later than in the 90s. In this second to last chapter, I shift from, I talk about visions and the stories that people have told me, right, for the first two chapters. And then I move on to inventing some visions. And then in this fourth chapter, I'm reinterpreting some popular tales in the service of explaining how Comunidades Negras resist environmental racism and champion environmental justice, right? And I don't think I have the time to do it, but I was going to break down this image, right, piece by piece, right, and tell you stories about each one of the stories that makes up this composite image. So this is a story about a community and the disappearance of the supernatural from their community. This is a story about a very self-centered man who haunts a community that try to help him out, and it's actually kind of a side story, or it's a story that I reinterpret to talk about people that are self-centered and cultivate coca in their communities and put the rest of the community at risk. This is a story about slavery that I reinterpreted as a story about drug trafficking. This is a story about this particular entity that's half man and half tree. And it's a way to kind of frame right to prior consultation which is an instrument, a legal instrument used by a lot of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in the Americas to champion their rights. And it requires validation by international scholars who can say that, yeah, these are the damages that were caused to this particular community, right? And then in the end, I pose a question about, the significance as a question about political ontology, right? And what is the meaning behind these beliefs as they disappear? Is this man stepping into modernity, or is this something else happening? And which is why there's a question mark, right? And so in summary, I'd just like to highlight some of the conclusions that I make in this book. The first is that environmental justice studies demonstrates how physical violence and environmental racism are rooted in a lot of the same structures, which is why they can't be addressed separately, as if they're completely unrelated phenomena. Global environmental justice studies, which I'm arguing for in this particular book, reveals the transnational dimensions of both environmental racism and justice. And then in the third place, critical global environmental justice studies demands that both humans and more than humans are indispensable to justice for ecological communities. And towards the end of the book, I get into the subject of rights of nature, which touches upon the relation between humans and more than humans. So that's it. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so we can take questions, maybe perhaps from the room initially, and then I'll give us some time to collect some questions from the people watching on the webinar as well. Want to go and field your own questions from the room? Sure.
A great presentation. Thank you very much. And I actually had relatives in Cali for many years. They had a furniture store.
Oh, very cool.
And sometimes they cause environmental problems because of the kinds of material they use. But anyway, it was a long time ago. Here, my question is, give us a little bit of idea of the kind of the legal landscape that some of these communities are dealing with. So in the United States, we have their environmental justice lawsuits that use geographic information systems to show differential effects and things like that. And obviously those are state-based solutions. But just sort of, if you're a community and you want to do something, to sort of strike back at the differential effects of these pesticides, I'm saying, what are some of your legal recourses in Colombia? That would be a question.
Should I go ahead and answer the question?
Sure.
So I actually took part in a court case in which 26,000 Colombians were suing the Colombian police, which is in charge of this war on drug strategy, and other entities for damages caused. And, there was indigenous communities in that case. There were Afro-descendant communities, Comunidades Negras in that case, but there are also just regular campesino communities that don't have that kind of ethnic affiliation. And so for the ethnic communities, they always kind of gravitate towards, prior consultation. We should have been asked about what was happening in our lands before anything happened, right? And that wasn't a successful strategy for Comunidades Negras, because for indigenous communities, at least some indigenous communities can say that they cultivate coca traditionally, but for Afro-descendant communities, they can't make that same claim. So the lawyer that I work with actually used this strategy, which he calls prueba diabólica, which is, how do you say prueba diabólica? Like diabolic.
Like an ultra hazardous activity, basically.
But basically, the argument is that it's the devil something. I forget what the translation is in English, but it's basically that it's impossible to state that that all these 26,000 people were in the right in terms of cultivating coca or not cultivating coca. It's now on the state to prove that the response was justified. So it's shifting the burden towards the state, right? And while the state has all these, I went through the boxes of evidence, boxes of evidence of like logs of aerial eradication missions, and all the pilots signed the logs, and the local ombudsman was supposed to sign off on this mission, and so on and there. So all this paperwork, like the climatic conditions were correct, and this. So the response of the opposite response of the people suing in this case is, well, this should have never happened, and these are all the things that damaged. So they use like econometrics to try to establish the value of a river, of different geographical features of a wetland, right? And it's kind of weird because it's taking those natural entities out of their cultural context and monetizing everything, right? So there is a kind of question about what effect is that going to have on those communities if now they don't just look at it as a tree, as in all these different ways that they would normally look at a banana tree or whatever. Now they're looking at it as what value does it have, and what it is its replacement value, right? And these are things that simply just you can't put that value into. It's hard to put it into words, let alone monetary value. So it's a very interesting kind of tug and pull, and it, like I said, it requires. They're not going to believe people from the community when they write down their estimates of what. So that's why people like myself, people that work with these international NGOs that come down there and do these calculations for them, are kind of really vital to them winning any kind of case. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You touched on necropolitics versus biopolitics.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on those theories.
Sure. So it is quite a bit of work to elaborate on, but I talk about biopolitics in a very loose manner in a beginning of the book, and talking about the function of these different entities to protect people from, like, tell your child not to go out into the forest because so-and-so is going to grab them, right? And it's really about not getting lost in the forest in a lot of cases. But so it had that, I argue that there is a kind of a precursor to biopolitics there, right? And I really just, and I know people could be very critical of that because it's not a very in-depth exploration of biopolitics, but at the same time, it's really just setting me up to talk about necropolitics, which I understand to be a critique of biopolitics, whereas biopolitics is about maximizing the life of certain populations, right? Necropolitics is about eliminating people for the survival of other populations, like the direct elimination. So I argue that this war on drugs strategy does have these necropolitical dimensions, both in the way that it's carried out and the way that it's explained in hindsight. Because one of the things that happened in Colombia is you have these kind of just say no to drugs kind of sounding campaigns that blame drugs for everything bad happening in the country, when we know that's not true. That there's decades of conflict that have been happening, and that drugs, there's a lot of problems associated with drug trafficking and drug production, but the root problem is the structures. It's not the drug, it's not those things. So, I start off talking about necropolitics, and then I talk about kind of coca cultivation in the realm of extractive ecologies and kind of necropolitical ecologies that become self-sustaining, right? Because the more that they're conducted, the more power paramilitaries and these large landowners have, and their operations can continue to expand into shifts in new parts of the country and new spaces. And then I talk in the context of Cali, I talk about it being a necropolitan area, right? Where there's parts of that city, just like there are in many parts of the world, where violence is super concentrated, right? And so the idea being, if these activities are contained to this part of the city, then the rest of the population doesn't have to deal with it. But it also means that the people that live in that area are scapegoated for that, right? And so it's like, oh, you Black people have ruined our city, right? Both in terms of violence and drug trafficking, and also their presence as polluters. They're perceived as polluters, right? Yeah. So that's, yeah, it goes way more in depth than that, but that's on the surface. That's where I take it. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
I was, thanks for a great presentation and fascinating work. I was thinking about the longue durée history of mangroves, because Judy Carney's written about how they become sites of marronage communities. And that there may be a longer durée arc of kind of to some of these kind of illicit activities. But I was also thinking about, couldn't you don't really draw upon Taussig, but wouldn't Taussig's stuff on devil pack narratives work for this material? On the one hand, you have a lot of violent deaths, which often, are explained through assault sorcery stories. And then the other thing that strikes me is the ways in which, the deaths, and then also you have people are coming in here to make money.
Right.
So could that work in terms of your material? But I also wanted to mention, we have a faculty member, Erin Cooney, who has a project right now at the Torrance Art Museum on environmental justice, and it's called Aire Libre, and it's about Torrance is an area that has become a site of all this hazardous, toxic pollution, and so her we should all go to see this exhibit, which is shining a light on the backstage of a lot of industries in LA that we're not aware of, where the toxins are going, and it's to disadvantage communities like the folks in Cali.
Right. Right. Yeah. So you mentioned mangroves. I don't specifically reference Judith's work, but right, that I should look more into it. There's an interesting connection too, because I visited communities way north of where I did research, and the mangroves is where a lot of drug traffickers hide on their way to Central America. So there's an interesting connection there. And then with the second thing you mentioned,
Taussig.
Oh, Taussig. I can't remember if I cited Taussig. I don't think I do. I studied the bibliography, but I do mention devil packs, and I do mention how they've kind of transformed over time in the kind of ways that you're describing, where they're now affiliated with like drug trafficking, violence. But that's through other citations that I've done. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the devil is very prominent in this book. Yeah.
I just have a question then.
Sure.
So, like, on the one hand, the communities that you've done your research among are facing the environmental catastrophe of insecticide or of herbicides being sprayed above, from above of their crops. On the other hand, you have drug traffickers that are invading the territory too. And so, like, what is their alternative vision? Right. It's like you remove on the one hand. So let's say they stop spraying.
Yeah.
Well, then the cartel just comes back in and starts growing again. And so what's the solution to get their own sovereignty back?
So a lot of folks look at this, especially the really outspoken leaders of the process of Black communities, look at this as the state kind of letting this happen and allowing their own communities to be dispossessed and displaced. And a lot of the arguments center on the fact that who these guys are, you could easily stop them from coming in, and you don't. So that's
the cartels and the Americans, so to speak.
Correct. Right. And so I think the main issue is that when I showed that map of how disconnected it is from roads, it's disconnected from this area. It's an area of the world disconnected from global markets. So there's a lot of debate about whether being more connected would be a bad thing or a good thing, right? And in the meantime, what is the most profitable thing is you see, I'm listening nowadays, I visit and I'm hearing mariachi music. You're seeing like signs of the Sinaloa cartel, right? Like it's becoming globalized, but not in the kind of traditional way that the legal way, right? So That's a continual subject of debate. There's a lot of internal debate about what's best for people there. There's no really easy answer. It's very contested and it's very touchy topic. Yeah.
Yeah, question. Oh, Stephen.
No, no. Well, at one time people would have thought a lot in terms of emerging wars and peripheries in different geographical scales. The longer sort of cultural historical geography of this particular part of the Americas is a complicated one. It's always been shifting. The Colombian state is not a static matter in the juridical sense, in the administrative sense, of whole matter of people's relationship to land strikes me as always of ongoing significance. For my reading this, and I'm trying to follow without reading a book, which I'm ready yet, right? It's highly original and it's a remarkably creative vision. They're using the word, but it comes to the front of my mind of very complex things. But I'm a little bit fascinated that you privilege, in a sense, the interest in your earlier chapters of the book. Is that, well, all this stuff about territorialization, etc. I don't know how you phrased it. You sort of reduced our interest in those matters to a certain extent. I remain extremely interested in those matters, as well as the unpacking as best you can of visions and what these visions rest upon. Yes, I have to congratulate you. It's a highly original piece of work you've given us. Gets us all thinking, and it's interesting when you throw out questions to what do you make of this. You had quite a number of people coming from different
very different angles,
having a go at trying to understand something. So, what's education about? That's good.
Thank you. So, for everyone that doesn't know, or most of you should have no idea, Dr. Bo's part of the MA committee for the thesis where I wrote it ends up becoming a chapter in this book, right? And it also, like I said, provides the structure of you can see it in the table of contents, right? And I do a deep dive on territorialization throughout the book, but in the interest of trying to hit on a lot of different topics that I presented to you today, I just didn't have as much space for it. But yeah, that is fundamental to it's fundamental to the kind of struggle happening in this particular site. And so you can't have a conversation about land in Colombia and not hear the word territorio like over and over and over again, even for folks that don't have quote unquote, they're a specifically demarcated boundary for whatever their land is. They still use the term in a very in lots of different ways. So I'll leave it there.
Any final thoughts?
I think just one last question.
Sure.
It's like less about the book, but like how you got there, because I was wondering, since the community are having a lot of issues with outsiders and like Americans, like what was your in, and like how were you able to build confidence in these communities?
So I was a MA student here, and I heard a visiting professor give a talk about this particular region of the Colombia. So that's who I ended up doing my PhD research with, and he was my in because he was very well connected to these organizations, and yeah, there was no visiting this research without that connection, because from the first place I wouldn't have felt safe, right? And then people felt responsible for my safety a lot of the time, so it also kind of limited the degree to which I could go out and do a lot of these interviews, because there was someone always worried about me, right? So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and for a little bit further context, I had planned on doing that same research on the disappearance of the supernatural from the countryside and the reappearance of the city for my PhD, for my dissertation. But I was taking a class in political ecology and I was handed a piece of paper. It was an open letter to the international community decrying this war on drug strategy as biochemical warfare of the Colombian government against its own people and push an agenda pushed by the United States. And I was like, oh wow, this is like everything lining up perfectly. This is what I should be doing research on. And so what ends up happening is I ended up combining these two projects into this book.